if you're in school, if you're in public school, whether it's grade school or high school or college, you get bombarded with evolution. How many know what I'm talking about? Yeah, even in private schools, even many Christian schools believe in what we call theistic evolution. Have you heard of theistic evolution? So we're going to talk about all these different models just because we need to know where people are coming from. And then what we are praying for is what we call a paradigm shift. Do you know what a paradigm shift is? So how do we get someone who espouses evolution, that everything occurred naturally without a God? Some people actually believe that. In fact, most scientists believe naturalistic evolution. It's called neo-Darwinism. But we're hoping that these topics will help you to examine the nature of this debate and will arm you to help people achieve a paradigm shift. So today we're going to talk about the origin of the debate. It's a 6-part series. Then we'll talk about the origin of humankind, then the origin of oceans, then the origin of dinosaurs, then the origin of Earth, and the origins of the universe. So we will draw evidence from models offered by science and scripture. And, it seems for some people, in fact, in many people's minds, it seems that science and religion are in combat. And many religionists say that there's no room for religion and science. And some people even say there's no... But in truth, we will discover that true science and the Bible are in complete harmony. And we will see that you can be a scientist and have complete faith in the Genesis account of creation. All right. So this morning we're going to look at the origin of the debate. Now, the subject has been I think I've seen bumper stickers about something like this. At least I've seen half of them, either one half or the other. And so even the bumper stickers, people are talking about this debate between creation and evolution. Now, did you know that in 2017, Gallup had a poll, and they asked Americans, where do you think we came from? And they gave 3 options. First option is recent creation, according to what the Bible said. This is very much like the biblical account of creation. And then they also had a natural evolution. In other words, Darwinian or neo-Darwinian evolution. And then theistic evolution, which is a combination. Some people, they really believe in science, but they also believe in God. And so they try to put it together and say that, God created using evolution. And so 38% of Americans believed in a recent creation. And then 38% believed in theistic evolution. In other words, God created using the mechanism of evolution. And then finally, 19% favored natural evolution. Now, it used to be only 10% used to believe this, but now there are more younger people, and I don't know if you've noticed this, but many young people these days feel that religion is the source of all the world's problems, like the wars and the strife, and so they try to have nothing to do with God. And so, because of that movement, many people that number has increased in the past 100 years. Now, the word science comes from Latin, and it means a system of acquiring knowledge based on scientific method, as well as the organized body of knowledge gained through such research. Now, there are two types of science, as Elder Ray talked about. Hard science. This is testable science, something that can be observed, predicted, and you can use this to reproduce things that happen in a lab. And you can verify things that you observe. So hard science is interpreted using experiments, but sometimes people put their worldview into hard science. But in contrast to hard science, we have something called historical science. It's not testable because you can't reproduce the creation of the world. Whether you believe in creation in 6 literal days or in the Big Bang, it's not something that's reproducible. And so it's heavily favored by models and worldview. And depending on your worldview, you will look at the same data and have completely different interpretation. And that's why we don't agree on everything. We all see the same data, but the interpretation is different. And so when we look at worldview, we consider things like, what is your supreme authority? In other words, what is the final answer? When there's a conflict, what is the one that you go to? So in a lot of scientific institutions, the leading scientists of these days, a lot of them, their supreme authority is what? Science, right? They call it science. Or it could be God, or it can be some other thing. A second thing that determines your worldview is where did everything originate from? Okay, and this is what we're talking about in these 6 talks. But then the third thing is, what is your place in this world? What is the meaning of your life? What is your moral code? What determines right and wrong? Okay, and how do you identify it? And finally, what is your future? So all these things will contribute to your worldview. And based on your worldview, you can look at the data, and people with different worldviews will see things differently. And it's so important to realize that. So in 1998, they polled the members of the National Academy of Sciences. You know anyone in the National Academy of Sciences? So these are thought and policy leaders in science education. And they asked these thought and policy leaders, do you believe in a personal God? How many people do you think said yes? Only 7%. So do you see the disparity? It's so different than the Americans, the public at large, which almost 80% said that they believed in God. They also asked, if you don't believe in God, how sure are you that He does not exist? And those who disbelieved in a personal God was 72%. So these are the thought and policy leaders that determine how science education is conducted in America. And then 21% identified as agnostic, and so they had doubts, and they didn't want to make a final statement. And you see a lot of people this way. And you know, these leading scientists, they will shape the future of their students. And so a full 93% of these thought leading scientists still reject God. But you know, Western science, the roots of Western science is totally different. In fact, do you know who this is? This is Sir Isaac Newton. People, when they started the endeavor we call science, their motivation was to study nature as the works of the Creator, right? And that's why this great scientist, Isaac Newton, he said, no sciences are better attested than the religion of the Bible. There was no conflict between believing in a creator God and then interpreting what he saw in nature. So, how did this change? Now, from about 1200 to about the 19th century, universities like Cambridge here only taught that God created the world, just like the Bible said. And for centuries, all graduates tended to think the same as their professors. However, in the last couple hundred years, today's university in the West, guess what? Totally about face, 180-degree diametric opposition. They only teach that nature, the material world, created and organized everything we see. And so most graduates now believe and tend to think the same as the professors. In fact, one of the things that led to this was they changed the rules. Have you ever played a game with somebody who likes to change the rules? Yes. Well, this is one gentleman, and I'm not judging him as a person, but I'm just showing that he was instrumental in changing the rules, at least in showing that they wanted the rules to be changed. And look at what he says. This is Richard Lewontin, and he wrote this in 1997. He says, "We have a prior commitment to materialism. Moreover, a materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door." Okay? So materialism he's talking about is not like owning a Mercedes-Benz. So that's not what he's talking about. What he's talking about is that everything is what you can observe scientifically. And beyond that, there's nothing. So he ruled out God. And that is actually changing the rules. Because how do you know that there is not God? You don't, right? But they said there can't be a God. And so they changed the rules about science. And so they have corrupted science by taking away the creator. How many of you know this gentleman, Richard Dawkins? Yeah. He said that biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. And the reason he says this is it's evident when you study biology, everything is incredibly well designed. And the reason is it is designed. Beloved, it's because it is designed. But people like him and Francis Crick, they say we must keep in mind constantly that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. So is that a scientific thing to do? No, it's not. So by eliminating one possibility, they're thinking that they're being scientific, but they're actually being totally unscientific. And this is what Francis Crick did. So, but the human mind is such that if you see something like this rock formation, you can understand, well, yeah, it could be random. But then when you look over here, you know that this cannot be random, right? It has to be designed. It was structured. All right. So the biggest and most fundamental science question of all will always reveal a worldview. And that question is, how did life appear? Where ultimately did life come from? And you would think that scientists by now would have a theory that they all agree with. But they don't even agree on the definition of life. Here's one from Webster's. Life is a principle or force that is considered to underlie the distinctive quality of animate beings, characterized by a capacity for metabolism, growth, reaction to stimuli, and reproduction. So it's a little bit of an underwhelming definition, isn't it? And in fact, there is no consensus on how to define life. There may be even several forms of life, not only animals, but plants, fungus, bacteria. And if life did appear, it could have appeared multiple times in multiple things. One of the most obvious big questions that the evolutionists have to ask is, how did life arise from inorganic matter? And they have no idea how to answer that question. They say it remains a great unknown. American Scientists, 2009. In fact, did you know that scientists are now convinced that billions of years is not enough time to create the complexity that we see? And so they say maybe aliens came and colonized Earth with the specimens that they brought. And actually, some of the most well-renowned scientists in the world believe in this, because even trillions of years, when you look at it mathematically, it's not enough for all the species to have originated by the process of Darwinian or even neo-Darwinian evolution. Stephen J. Hawking talks about punctuated equilibrium because he sees that long ago there was an explosion of all the phyla that appear all at once in the rock layer. They cannot explain this. Yeah, even trillions of years could not account for it. So they're backed into this corner. Oh, it must be from an alien, or maybe some meteorite, or maybe some fragments of a supernova explosion. They just don't know. And it's so important to realize this. Now, so that's one view. Louis Pasteur, who was the famous French biologist, he said that life must come from life. There's no known circumstances in which it can be confirmed that microscopic beings came into the world without germs, without parents similar to themselves. So, I mean, look all around you. This is evident, right? That all life comes from similar parents. And so his theory, the Pasteur theory, disproved the theory of spontaneous generation. And yet, this law, which we call biogenesis, which is so evident and so plain and scientifically founded, all the almost all modern scientists believe totally in something different, and it's called abiogenesis. That is, that life came about by a natural chemical process or from a chemical vent or pool. And they even tried to make an experiment which they put ammonia and carbon dioxide and a spark and try to get some living chemicals. But they couldn't even get DNA, which is the blueprint of life. So they realized this is not the answer. But why won't they accept creation? Why can't they even accept intelligent design? Because of that rule, can't use God. You can't use God. But see, that change in the rules is not scientific in itself. These things are beyond them, beyond their ability to explain how the even basic chemicals of life came to be. Some people said, well, maybe this primordial soup had bubbles in it, and those bubbles became cells. And it's kind of looking at, when they had these really crude microscopes. Robert Hooke was the first one who saw living cells, and they looked like little rooms of a monastery. And so he called them cells. That's what cell means, a room. But by the time Darwin's time came, they knew that there were things other than just water, and they called it protoplasm. But now in our day, we know of organelles, we know of the nucleus, we know of little machines that the cell makes that will do all sorts of functions in the cell. It's so complex. It's more complex than New York City. And so Michael Behe says, now it's the turn of the fundamental science of life, modern biochemistry to disturb. The simplicity that was once expected to be the foundation of life has proven to be a phantom. Instead, systems of horrendous, irreducible complexity inhabit even the simplest bacterial cell, even the simplest cell. Do you see that? And we could spend a lot of time talking about the incredible complexity of a simple cell, but our time is coming to a close. So let's just leave it at that there are 40 trillion cells in our bodies. And if you even think of it in the crudest types of functions, there are over 200 different types of functions. And so we're talking big time complexity. So how did Darwin get his foot in the door? Well, here's what happened. People started, and all this is driven because of their worldview. They don't want God to have to tell them, to have the right to tell them, this is the way, walk ye in it. They didn't want to hear his voice. And so the biblical scholars, much of them in the 19th century, they came up with something called higher criticism. And even those things that they were talking about were not true, it stuck in people's minds. And the Bible became regarded as something that they couldn't trust. And then they figured that there aren't things that they found fossils of, like dinosaurs. Did you know dinosaurs are actually in the Bible? Except they're called Behemoth and Leviathan. But it's in the Bible. But they figured, they didn't realize that. And these fossils tripped them up. And then they were ignorant about the complexity of genetics. And there was this growing belief, well, back then, they thought that the world was maybe 1 or 2 million years old. Now they realize that's not enough time. Even trillions of years isn't enough time. And so this man, Darwin, he was actually the child of a Presbyterian minister. He graduated as a religion major, and he signed up to be the naturalist on the HMS Beagle. And they were doing a map-making tour in 1831, and he brought back many specimens, including turtles and birds. And he came up with this theory that tried to explain why there were so many different types of turtle shells and bird beaks. And what he saw was something called survival of the fittest. If characteristics gave any of them an advantage, then it would help them survive and reproduce. But when you think about it, how will this help new species being formed? It can't. Because if survival of the fittest is true, there will be fewer and fewer species, not more and more. But anyway, this theory, people just grabbed at it because there were some people who didn't want God to be so powerful. But look at this title, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Did you realize that Hitler used Darwin's writings to come up with genocide? Genocide, everyone in this room, whether you're black or white or brown, our difference in DNA is minuscule. Okay. So he contributed this theory, but survival of the fittest doesn't change the genetic code. So they came up with something called neo-Darwinism. And that is that there are mutations that occur randomly. And that will confer an advantage. But did you know that most mutations are lethal? They cause all sorts of problems and diseases. So again, this mechanism would take way more than even trillions of years to get species that have an advantage. So many problems with these theories. How do mutations make new and better animals? They cannot answer this. Totally silent. And so this evolutionist, Dennis Noble, he's an evolutionist. But he himself says all the central assumptions of the modern synthesis, also called neo-Darwinism, have been disproved, he says. There's no evidence. There's no way you can show that what Darwin is talking about and what the new evolutionists, the neo-Darwinists are saying actually ever happens. So the technical literature, this is Stephen Meyer, in biology is now replete with world-class biologists routinely expressing doubts about various aspects of neo-Darwinian theory. And yet, none of it makes it into our classrooms. They still stubbornly teach this. It's all disproved, but it's still taught to our children. How disgraceful that they are fed lies, knowing that these are lies. Anyway, we know that this theory is in a crisis. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what is visible. And so, let me share a story about the Apostle Paul. He encountered some early Greek philosophers in Athens. And of course, Athens is considered the birthplace of Western science. And these philosophers questioned their traditions. And Paul was traveling in Athens, and he was waiting for some of his companions. in the marketplace. While Paul waited for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him when he saw that the city was given over to idols. Then certain Epicurean and Stoic philosophers encountered him, and some said, "What does this babbler say?" So the Epicureans, their philosophy was gods are not involved in this world. They're too busy having fun. And mankind should have the mindset of don't worry, be happy, live it up. And so this was Epicurus. That was his philosophy. There's no afterlife. In the end, it's just this life. Death is the end. And likewise, Zeno, even though in his thinking, he was a Stoic, so he taught that God is in nature and happiness comes from overcoming wrong attitude through increased knowledge. So that's what Stoicism is. But he also believed there was no afterlife. And so the main agreement is that there is no afterlife. And so when Paul came, he seemed to be a proclaimer of foreign gods because he preached to them Jesus and the resurrection. And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new doctrine is of which you speak." Then Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are very religious, for I was passing through, and concerning the objects of your worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To the unknown God.' Therefore, the one to whom you worship without knowing, him I proclaim to you." And he's using their traditions and their beliefs to achieve in them a paradigm shift. And he talks to him of the love of God. God who made the world and everything in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he worshipped with men's hand, as though he needed anything, since he gives to all life, breath, and all things. We ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, something shaped by art and man's devising. Truly, these times of ignorance God overlooked, but now commands all men everywhere to repent, because he has appointed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness, and by the man whom he has ordained. And he tells them about Jesus, how God gave his son because he loved the world, and he died for them, showing his love, and then raises him from the dead, giving assurance of life to all. And when they heard it, some of them mocked. They wouldn't believe when they thought, "Oh man, he's talking about resurrection of the dead." So these were the ones who couldn't believe that God is involved. They couldn't imagine anything like that. It's all against the laws of nature. A being who made heaven and earth, a creator who gives and actively maintains the life of all creatures, someone who can't be contained in temples and properly represented by our reason or art, a divinity above natural laws and fully capable of suspending them at will, a God. Sure, it may be a God of love, but we're responsible. And so they didn't believe that. However, some believed. They had what we call a paradigm shift, and their worldview changed as they saw a God of love, and they saw what was around them. And so they believed in this Creator God. Probably some of the most sublime and profound words ever penned in the Bible. Bereshit bara Elohim et ha-shamayim wa et ha-aretz. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. This is something that only God can do. He created everything. Now, there are some scientists. For instance, look at Alistair McGrath. And he wrote about Richard Dawkins. He was a colleague of his at Oxford University. And he shares his own story. Although, he says, I was passionately and totally persuaded of the truth and relevance of atheism as a young man, I subsequently found myself persuaded that Christianity was a much more interesting and intellectually exciting worldview than atheism. Amen. So can one be a creationist and do good science? Absolutely. Look at Wernher von Braun. He was at one time the head scientist at NASA. He said, religion and science are sisters. The one seeks knowledge of creation and the other of the Creator. And this is reflecting Ellen White's comment in Christian Education, page 66. Ellen White wrote, in the study of the sciences also, we are to obtain a knowledge of the Creator. All true science is but an interpretation of the handwriting of God in the material world. Science brings from her research only fresh evidences of the wisdom and power of God. Rightly understood, both the book of nature and the written word make us acquainted with God by teaching us something of the wise and beneficent laws through which He works. Amen.